Hello, this is the voice of Todd Miller in the background, and this is my case study presentation for EDL 852. To summarize the presentation, we were presented with a scenario where a previously high-performing teacher is having some difficulties in her personal life, and those difficulties are negatively impacting her professional life. Her principal, now needs to become involved. What I'm going to do in this presentation is take on the role of the principal and suggest a plan of action to help ensure the academic success and the well-being of the students. So, to start with some facts that were presented in the scenario, we know that Mrs. Horton has been an effective teacher in the past. Recently, she was a teacher of the year in her school. I'm going to assume from that information that her knowledge of best practices is above average. I'm also going to assume that she's capable and willing to form positive relationships with students, parents, and colleagues. Here's what else we know. As good as she's been in the past, it's taken a turn for the worse. Her demeanor and professionalism really kind of tanked beginning in spring break. They didn't get any better over the summer, and they worsened throughout the following year. Mrs. Wilson, the principal, had an opportunity to intervene in the spring and summer when she noticed a change in the demeanor, but failed to do so, presumably because of her statement that she was reluctant to rock the boat as she was a fairly new principal in the building. Recently, also, the school was selected to pilot a new reading curriculum. Mrs. Horton was very unsupportive of the change in the reading curriculum. The case study doesn't talk about why she's unsupportive, but we do know that her interactions with colleagues on the topic have often been negative and quite unprofessional. Mrs. Wilson, the principal, had a conversation with the teacher. It's inferred in the case study that it was a strongly worded conversation, and that resulted in no change of behavior regarding the curriculum change. Now, in the fall, we have some parents who are reporting abusive behavior and unprofessionalism. A number of them have even contacted the Board of Education. Parents are reporting that she's being verbally abusive to students, she's arriving late to school, and that she's refused to hold parent-teacher conferences with them. The principal's been in the classroom, hasn't observed any of this behavior, but that fact is not reassuring to the teachers. And so one day a father comes in, terribly upset, has the same kinds of concerns that the other parents have, and insists on a conference with the principal. And what he wants is to have his daughter, Julie, moved out of the classroom. Mrs. Wilson does a couple of things correctly. First, she knows that she needs to gather more information. So instead of reacting immediately upon the father's request, she knows that she needs to get more information from the classroom teacher and from the parents. And so she does the second thing correctly. She schedules a conference where the three of them can sit at a room at a table together. But conference goes horribly wrong. Mrs. Horton is very unprofessional in her reaction to the parents' concerns, and the whole situation rapidly escalates into an issue that now is in dire need of intervention. There are some things that I don't know about the situation. My primary concern has to be for the academic and well-being of the students. The principal, Mrs. Wilson, needs to find out what's really happening in the classroom that's caused concern for the parents of those students. I would ask the Board of Education and the superintendent which parents have been contacting them, who those children are, and specifically what are their concerns. Additionally, I think Mrs. Wilson needs to know where is the communication breakdown occurring between the parents and the teacher? How is Mrs. Horton communicating or lack thereof. Unrelated to students directly and the parent concerns, there's a second issue where a rift has been created between Mrs. Horton and her colleagues. Aside from the lack of professionalism in the way they interact regarding to this new reading curriculum, Mrs. Horton does have some concerns. And as the principal, I need to understand specifically what concerns does she have with the change in the reading curriculum. And finally, it was reported to Mrs. Wilson by some other teachers in the building that Mrs. Horton's husband has left her and she's now raising 2 teenage boys on her own, and that is what's affecting her professional life. I need, as the principal, to have that conversation with Mrs. Horton. Rather than taking the word of the other teachers, I need to find that out directly from her. That conversation could start just simply as, hey, I noticed that you're not quite where you are in your instruction as you used to be. Is there something that you feel is going on that you would like to discuss? And so to summarize that problem, we've got a poor classroom environment that's been created by Mrs. Horton's actions and treatment towards students. Multiple parents are expressing concern and demanding action, and it seems that the issues are stemming from things going on in Mrs. Horton's personal life rather than a lack of professional knowledge or skill. So I'm the principal, and I've put together a plan of action. I've included 3 steps. And the first step is related specifically to the little girl whose parents came in for a conference, Julie Stafford. And I believe that the relationship between the teacher and the parents is beyond repair at this point. The lack of respect and rapport between the two is going to have negative repercussions on the academic success of Julie. So Mrs. Wilson should honor the request of her parents to move Julie to another classroom. This needs to be done carefully. It should be done collaboratively. It should involve the principal, the school counselor, the grade level team, or some members of the grade level team. And if there are any identified students that might be impacted, it needs to include the special education teacher. They need to work together to make sure that transferring Julie doesn't overload the class size or negatively affect the student dynamics within that existing class. The principal, Mrs. Wilson, needs to facilitate and monitor this transfer. She needs to make sure that any data regarding Julie's academic performance and well-being gets passed from Mrs. Horton to the new teacher, and she needs to monitor the transition for several weeks. I think the principal should use a combination of classroom walkthroughs, conferences with the new teacher, parent communication, and an informal talk or two with Julie in the lunchroom or hallway to monitor. Finally, we need to work on the relationship between the school and Mr. and Mrs. Stafford. Mrs. Wilson should offer an apology for the situation and should expect Mrs. Horton to do the same. She should advise Mrs. Horton to communicate via email, make an apology, and then document that conversation. A humble apology can go a long way to mending relationships. Step 2 of my proposed action plan is related to all of the other students. And Mrs. Wilson needs to understand the nature of this perceived verbal abuse that's going on in the classrooms. She and or the counselor should conduct some informal conferences with the students. They can ask questions like, hey, how's your week been in Mrs. Horton's class? Or, are you enjoying school today? Is everything going good? And that way they can gather some information from the kids about the classroom environment. Of course, she needs to communicate with the parents during this time. They need to be reassured that she's monitoring their children's well-being and academic success, as well as giving Mrs. Horton the support that she needs to improve. At this time, I wouldn't recommend reassigning the other students to another classroom, even if parents are requesting that. There are just too many students involved, and the transitions would not be good for the kids. Instead, I would demand an increased level of parent communication from Mrs. Hortman, keeping those communications positive as often as possible. I would ask Mrs. Horton to keep a log of parent communication, have a minimum required number of parent contacts per month or per quarter, depending on the number of students, and the principal should review that log regularly. Finally, I think Mrs. Horton needs to be given some flexibility in her daily schedule to work on rebuilding positive relationships with the students. Perhaps she could be allowed to take the class out for an extra resource or two in the next couple of weeks, just to have time to reconnect personally with the students. Mrs. Wilson the principal needs to have ongoing and frequent monitoring of the students' well-being. This should be accomplished through classroom walkthroughs in Mrs. Horton's class, conferences with Mrs. Horton, and continue those informal conversations with students as often as possible. Step 3 of my proposed action plan is related to the instructional capacity of the teacher and the school. It's time for Mrs. Wilson to have that long overdue and frank conversation with Mrs. Horton. She does need to let her know that there are significant concerns being reported by parents and that her unprofessional behavior during that conference with Mr. Stafford seems to support those parent claims. She needs to know that she has been a very valuable member of the school for a long time and that she has the skills to be a very effective teacher. But the situation right now warrants a plan of assistance. I think Mrs. Wilson needs to address 3 main concerns with Mrs. Horton. First, the classroom environment and the relationships need to improve with parents. Mrs. Wilson needs to provide a couple of strategies to be implemented. One should be the communication log and required number of parent contacts. Another is the 6-to-1 strategy, where the teacher focuses on giving 6 positive reinforcements to 1 negative for each student. Mrs. Wilson might also look at restructuring the use of building aids to allow for more time for aides to be in Mrs. Horton's classroom. The addition of a building aid could relieve some of the stress of classroom management and instructional time, and less stress for the teacher means that she might respond more appropriately to student needs. Second, Mrs. Wilson needs to address this resistance to the reading curriculum. She needs to listen to Mrs. Horton's concerns. Mrs. Horton is an experienced teacher and might have valid concerns about the curriculum that could be addressed. Her opinion, if it's given in a respectful manner, and it hasn't been, should be valued. That being said, veteran teachers often have much difficulty transitioning to a new curriculum. Mrs. Wilson should organize a peer mentor or instructional coach who can help Mrs. Horton implement the curriculum effectively. In this way, she can develop Mrs. Horton's instructional capacity for all of the students in her classroom. Third, Mrs. Wilson needs to do what she can to take care of Mrs. Horton. This might include being available to talk and listen more frequently and encourage colleagues to do the same. My guess is Mrs. Horton will improve if there's a support system at school that's reaffirmed. She can encourage Mrs. Horton to seek professional services to deal with her personal issues. If the district allows the use of the counselor from school or has other resources that they could be offered, and if Mrs. Horton belongs to a professional organization, she should be reminded that they likely have resources as well. Finally, there needs to be an exit plan. How will Mrs. Wilson know that progress has been met? There are 3 pieces of data that she can look to. First, a reduction or elimination in the number of parent complaints. Second, consistent positive walkthrough observations. And third, positive comments from students and colleagues. Mrs. Wilson could consider using the same 6-to-1 strategy. When the ratio between positive data points and negative data points is greater than 6-to-1, progress goals have been met. But if improvement's not evident, We need to have some things in place just in case. An additional plan of assistance, potentially a leave of absence, or a termination need to be considered if necessary. I firmly believe that the principal has an obligation to help teachers improve. But student academic success and well-being have to be the number one priority. So, to summarize, how did we resolve the issue? First, we moved Julie to another classroom. This eliminated the most critical conflict between the teacher and the parents. It was done with as smooth a transition as possible to minimize the effect on Julie's academic success. Improvement is sought in areas of teacher, student, and parent-teacher relationships and communication for all others in Mrs. Horton's class. This eliminated the pitfalls for all students of a few being reassigned to classrooms. Mrs. Horton was given specific strategies to employ on improving her relationships and communication. In addition, she is given additional support in implementing the new reading curriculum. She was also offered and encouraged to utilize support in her personal troubles. The increase in her teaching effectiveness increased the instructional capacity of the school. Additionally, Mrs. Wilson faced a challenging leadership scenario for the first time and had to grow professionally in the process. Her own professional growth will make her a stronger building leader who is more able to enhance this instructional capacity of all teachers in her school. So to debrief, some thoughts and feelings that I had as I went through this. My first reaction to reading the problem was that Mrs. Wilson missed 3 opportunities to help Mrs. Horton and failed to take them. She didn't reach out to Mrs. Horton in the spring or summer when she first noticed a change in demeanor. That don't rock the boat mentality impeded her leadership. Second, there's no evidence in the case study to suggest that Mrs. Wilson attempted to understand or address Mrs. Horton's concern in piloting the new reading curriculum. This may have been a missed opportunity for shared leadership, and this may have been a missed opportunity for instructional coaching. Third, she failed to address the parent concerns in a prompt manner. Instead, she waited until that situation exploded with Mr. Stafford before she intervened in a significant way. The principal has to be a problem solver. I imagine Mrs. Wilson's day started early, catching up on emails, piling up in her inbox, and structuring her day. But the plans quickly go out the window when an issue arises. It's important to be prepared with a variety of tools, strategies, and interventions for both students and staff so that you can respond to unexpected challenges. Third thought, shared leadership is critical. In moving Julie to another class, asking the counselor for assistance, or using a peer mentor or instructional coach, the principal was asking members of her staff to contribute, make sacrifices, and share in shared leadership. Finally, the principal must be a parent, both to the student and to the staff. Not every child has a good day every day, but as a parent, you love them and you help them grow. In this case, Mrs. Wilson had to be the mama bear and react immediately to protect the well-being of Julie. She also had to take time and consider what was best for all the other students. And she knows that having effective teachers in the classroom is best for students, so she had to parent Mrs. Horton too. Parenting means setting expectations, holding the child accountable, and giving them the resources to be successful. Mrs. Wilson did all 3 of those things for Mrs. Horton. There are some unresolved issues in this case study. First, there's no real resolution regarding Mrs. Horton's well-being. It's clear that the well-being of the teacher has a significant impact on student academic success and well-being. And although a principal can be a listening post, an advocate, or a resource, they can't mandate anything outside of the professional responsibilities and the negotiated agreement. Although I made suggestions to guide Mrs. Horton towards counseling, there's no ability to ensure that it happens. One can only hope that the teacher recognizes the need, and takes those steps on their own. Another significant yet unresolved component of the scenario was the damaged staff relationships that grew out of the reading curriculum change. Again, the principal can't mandate that everyone gets along. Team building activities can be planned for staff development, but in the end, you have to have the expectation that the staff will maintain a high level of professionalism and have the shared vision of success for all students. Third, there was also non-student-centered concerns that I wasn't able to address in the case study. Particularly, at least one parent alleged that Mrs. Horton was not on time to school frequently. That would be a huge area of concern as a building principal, but I chose to focus on the student-centered aspects of the case study, so this one still remains unresolved. Finally, I've expressed the feeling that Mrs. Wilson failed to identify an area of need within her building and act accordingly. I think it's outside of the realm of this class and what my own professional growth needs to be to become a building principal in the future. But I think that Mrs. Wilson had some room to grow in how she initially handled the situation in a proactive way. So, Standard 2, regarding instructional capacity, states, an educational leader promotes the academic success and the personal well-being of every student by enhancing instructional capacity. I'd like to go through this standard and discuss how I addressed each one of the three components of this standard. I'm going to start with instructional capacity and call that component 1. And I did 3 things to address enhancing instructional capacity in this case study. First, I developed a plan of assistance for a classroom teacher in need. The plan covered areas of professionalism, relationships, communication, curriculum and instruction, and personal well-being. By acting as a coach, a building leader is able to improve the effectiveness of one teacher at a time, leading to an enhanced instructional capacity of the whole school. Secondly, my plan involved the principal, the teacher, the counselor, other teachers, and building aides in its implementation. The principal and the counselor were both instrumental in identifying the problem and monitoring and ensuring the students' well-being. The principal collaborated with the counselor and other teachers to identify the best placement for the student. And finally, mentors and building aides were used to help the teacher implement a new reading curriculum and manage the classroom. Last, I addressed the instructional effectiveness with regard to implementing a new reading curriculum. By using a peer mentor to help the teacher become more effective with the new curriculum, the instructional capacity within that classroom was enhanced. We're going to call component 2 of the standard the promotion of academic success for every student. I did that in this case study. First, research shows that effective teachers are the most important factor in the academic success of students. My assistance to the classroom teacher is assisting the students. The personal well-being of the teacher was creating a poor learning environment. By addressing that issue, the goal is for the environment to improve and in turn to promote academic success. Student placement into an appropriate learning environment is also important. In this scenario, a judgment had to be made: meet the parent request to transfer the student or not. Considering each student and family individually led to different decisions to be made for each student. This individualized approach is important in instruction and in management. By differentiating their approach, an administrator is promoting the success of every student. Finally, school programs must adopt research-based and effective curricula and must provide the resources needed to teachers to successfully implement it. In this case study, a contributing factor to the teacher's poor performance may have been a lack of ability to use the curriculum effectively. So, part of my plan of action involved providing the teacher with the support that she needed to improve. This promoted academic success of every student in her classroom. The final component of the standard is the promotion of the well-being of every student. I accomplished this by proposing 3 strategies in the case study. The first, positive relationships with students and families. The demographics of this school were not described in the case study, but we know that relationships are key for all students, but especially for students of poverty. 58% of the students in my own school are low SES. In my analysis, I promoted positive relationships by having frequent conversations with students and trying to ascertain the problem. This wasn't just about information gathering. It's also a strategy to let kids and parents know that someone in the building cared about them. Similarly, a positive relationship with parents allows them to feel that their concerns are heard and addressed. And positive relationships among staff help us share a common mission and common goals. I also promoted a safe learning environment. The strategy of 6-to-1 makes students feel comfortable, welcomed, and safe in the classroom. Working to alleviate the verbal abuse from the teacher creates a safe learning environment. And more adults visible in the classrooms as aides and mentors or during administrative walkthroughs leads to a safe learning environment. Finally, a positive connection between parents and schools is important. So often, a parent who had a bad experience as a student themselves are not supportive of their child's education. Having frequent and positive interactions with parents breaks down those barriers, and families become a happier, more included part of the school community. I want to take a minute here at the end to thank you for watching and thank you for listening to the presentation of this case study. I know that it's longer than probably is expected, but I felt that it was important as the capstone project of this class, not only to elaborate on the plan of study, but to try to provide ample explanation of why I put the plan of study together the way I did. So again, thank you for watching. Thank you for evaluating. I'll look forward to some feedback. It's been a good course, and thank you.